There's a letter sitting in the historical record, written in 1777, signed by Benjamin Franklin. It vouches for a Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben and calls him a lieutenant general who served at the right hand of Frederick the Great. Almost every important claim in that letter was false. Franklin knew it. The men who helped him write it knew it, and they sent it across the Atlantic anyway, into the hands of a Continental Congress that was about to stake the survival of the Revolution on a man whose real resume would have gotten him laughed out of the room. The strange part isn't that the lie was told. The strange part is that it worked, and that the man at the center of it turned out to be exactly what the dying American army needed. If you're new here, please like this video and subscribe to Nightveil Files. There's more buried history where this came from. Let's start with what was actually true about him, because the truth is the only reason the lie mattered. Steuben was born in 1730 in Magdeburg, in the heart of Prussia, into a military family. His father built fortifications and directed engineers, and the boy grew up inside the machinery of the most disciplined army Europe had ever produced. He put on a uniform young, fought through the 7 Years' War, and earned something most soldiers never got close to: a place in the orbit of Frederick the Great's general staff and a seat at the King's School for promising officers. That matters more than it might sound. Prussian staff training in the mid-1700s was the most advanced military education on the planet. It wasn't about bravery or swordsmanship. It was about systems, how you move thousands of men without chaos, how you turn a mass of individuals into a single instrument that responds to one command, how you make reloading and maneuver so automatic that a soldier does it correctly, even while terrified. Steuben learned all of it from the inside, and then the war ended and the bottom fell out of his life. Peacetime Prussia didn't need as many officers. Steuben was let go as a captain in 1763, and for the next 14 years, he drifted. He took a courtier's job at a small German court that gave him a baron's title and very little income. He chased loans he couldn't secure. He went looking for military work in one country after another and kept hearing the same answer: no. Nobody in a peaceful Europe needed a Prussian captain with expensive tastes and a stalled career. By 1777, he was 47, deep in debt, and nearly out of road. The skills in his head were worth a fortune to the right buyer. The problem was that no one in Europe was buying. The buyer, it turned out, was 3,000 miles away and losing. While Steuben was running out of options in Europe, the American Revolution was bleeding to death in the field. And the reason wasn't a lack of courage. The Continental Army had courage in surplus. What it lacked was something far less romantic and far more decisive: the ability to fight as one body. These were state militias stitched loosely together. A regiment from Virginia drilled one way, a regiment from Massachusetts drilled another, or didn't drill at all. There was no shared manual, no common set of commands, no agreed-upon way to do the basic mechanical things that decide 18th century battles. When British regulars, professionals who had rehearsed the same movements until they were reflex, came at them in a disciplined line with bayonets leveled, the Americans had no answer. They fired raggedly, lost their formation, and ran. Then came Valley Forge. In the winter of 1777 into 1778, Washington moved what was left of his army into that camp in Pennsylvania, and the cold and the hunger and the disease started doing the British Army's work for them. Men had no shoes. They wrapped their feet and left blood in the snow. Sickness moved through the huts faster than any musket volley. Soldiers slipped away in the night because there was nothing left worth staying for. Washington could see exactly where this ended. Not in a dramatic last stand, in a slow, quiet dissolution until one morning there simply wasn't an army anymore. He needed someone who could take this collapsing thing and make it function before the spring brought the British back. He didn't have that person. That person was on a ship. Steuben's path to that ship ran through Paris and through the 2 Americans stationed there trying to keep the revolution alive from across an ocean, Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane. Their first impression of Steuben was not promising, and the reason is its own small piece of history. Franklin and Deane were drowning in foreign officers. Every unemployed European with a sword and a sense of entitlement had been turning up in Paris demanding a general's commission and a general's salary in the American army. Congress had grown so sick of these men that it had effectively told its agents to stop sending them. So, when a broke former captain showed up looking for work, the answer was no. What changed it was the French government. Senior figures in the French War Ministry understood exactly what Prussian staff training was worth, even if Congress couldn't see it on paper. They pushed Franklin and Deane to look again, and out of that pressure came the solution that would define the rest of Steuben's life. If a captain couldn't get through Congress's door, they would simply send a general through it instead. The recommendation letter they produced promoted Steuben on paper to a rank he'd never held and a relationship with Frederick the Great he'd never had. It was, in the blunt phrase of one historian, a deception, full stop. But it was a deception with a purpose. Franklin wasn't lying to enrich himself. He was lying because the truth was too small to save a country, and the man behind the lie was, in the ways that counted, the real thing. Steuben sweetened it with a move that disarmed everyone. He didn't ask for a salary. He offered to work for nothing and to be paid only at the end, and only if the Americans won. For a Congress that had been burned again and again by mercenaries, an officer who put his own compensation on the line was almost impossible to turn away. They accepted, and they pointed him toward Valley Forge. He arrived in February of 1778 with a small entourage, a few translators, and a dog named Azor that followed him everywhere. He wore a silver star on his chest engraved with the word for faithfulness, and he carried himself like a man who had commanded armies. Against the backdrop of that ruined camp, half-starved men in rags, he looked like something out of legend. One soldier said he seemed like the god of war made flesh. Washington met him with caution. He'd seen impressive-looking foreigners before, but he gave the newcomer a chance to inspect the army and report back. And within a couple of weeks, he'd seen enough to hand Steuben real authority over training. What Steuben found when he looked closely nearly broke his composure. The sanitation was lethal. Latrines and kitchens sitting side by side, dead animals left where they fell. The drilling was non-existent or contradictory, and the bayonet, the weapon that decided close combat in that era, was treated by the average American soldier as little more than a tool for cooking meat over a fire. Here is the pivot the whole story turns on. A lesser man with a fake rank would have been exposed the moment he had to actually perform. Steuben was the opposite. The credential was hollow, but the competence underneath it was total. He knew precisely what was wrong and precisely how to fix it, and he started fixing it the same way he'd been taught in Prussia, from the ground up. His method was almost insultingly simple, and it was brilliant. He didn't try to train the whole army at once. He picked a single small group, about 100 men, and he trained them himself, not through subordinates, not from a distance, personally in the dirt before dawn, in his full uniform while the men around him wore rags. He physically moved their hands and feet into the right positions. He taught them to march at a fixed pace, to shift from column to line without falling apart, to handle a musket the same way every single time, until the motion lived in their muscles instead of their minds. And he taught them the bayonet as a weapon to be feared rather than a kitchen tool. No general of his supposed rank would have lowered himself to drill privates in the mud. That was beneath a man of his station. But Steuben had figured out something about these particular soldiers that a more conventional officer would have missed. They weren't serving a king, and they weren't in it for money. They were citizens who'd chosen this, and they would give everything to a leader who stood in the muck beside them rather than barking from a horse. His English was almost non-existent, which produced one of the most human details in the whole story. He wrote his drills in French, had them translated overnight by Washington's aides, and ran the training by sheer force of personality. When the men botched something, he'd lose his temper and curse them out in German, then French, and when he'd exhausted his own vocabulary, he'd order an aide to keep cursing on his behalf in English. The soldiers thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. It also made them his. He wasn't just drilling them. He was welding a demoralized crowd into something that felt like a team. Then came the multiplier that made all of it scale. Those first 100 men didn't just learn the drills, they learned how to teach the drills. Each of them carried the system back to his own unit and trained the next group, who trained the next. The competence spread outward through the entire army on its own, like a current, far faster than one man could ever have managed alone. While he was at it, Steuben rebuilt the camp's basic functioning, moving the latrines away from the food, imposing standards of sanitation that quietly saved more lives than any single battle ever cost. And in deciding which men should do the actual day-to-day instruction, he created something the American military had never formally had: a real corps of non-commissioned officers, the sergeants who hold an army together at the level where orders meet reality. Plenty of historians argue that this, not the bayonet drills and not the famous manual, was his single most lasting gift. The results showed up faster than anyone expected, and then they showed up where it counted, in front of the enemy. That spring, Washington staged a review and watched troops he'd last seen as a freezing mob move across the ground with the clean precision of a professional army. Congress confirmed Steuben as Inspector General with a real general's rank, the rank the letter had only pretended he already held. The fiction had become fact, earned the hard way. At Monmouth in the summer of 1778, the army marched out of Valley Forge and met British regulars in open battle. When the Redcoats came on with the bayonet, the maneuver that had always sent Americans running, the Americans held their ground and pushed back. The fight was, at best, a draw on paper. In every way that mattered, it was a verdict. The same men who couldn't hold a line months earlier had just traded blows with the finest army in the world and refused to break. A year later at Stony Point, soldiers drilled in Steuben's methods took a fortified British position in a night assault using bayonets alone, their muskets unloaded, crossing open ground and water and rock in the dark, and overwhelming the defenders by hand. The weapon Americans had once used to cook dinner had become the weapon that won the night. Then Steuben sat down and wrote it all permanently into the country's bones. His training manual, bound in blue paper because that was what the printer had during a wartime shortage, became known simply as the Blue Book, and it served as the official guide of the United States Army for more than 3 decades, outlasting the Revolution itself by a generation. He went on to serve through the end of the war, all the way to the siege at Yorktown, where the British finally surrendered, the trenches dug and held by men fighting with the discipline he had given them. And then, the part of the story almost nobody tells. The man who arguably saved the Continental Army was never properly paid for it. The bargain he'd struck, work now, get paid if we win, ran straight into a young, broke government that was slow to honor its debts. He lived above his means in his later years and watched what compensation did arrive vanish almost as fast. It took until 1790 for Congress to settle a pension on him. He spent his final years on a piece of granted land in rural New York, far from the dinners and the parades, and died there in 1794. No wife, no children, his estate left to 2 younger officers he'd come to treat as sons. So, what do you do with a man like this? Strip away the uniform and the silver star, and the foundation of one of the most powerful militaries in human history was laid by someone who got through the door on a forged resume. The rank was invented. The closeness to the Prussian king was inflated. The letter that introduced him to America was, by any honest measure, a lie. But the knowledge in his head was real. The transformation he produced was real, and it was measured in the only currency that doesn't lie: results on a battlefield against the best in the world. He took an army that didn't understand its own weapons and left it able to stand against an empire. He wrote the rule book that shaped American soldiers for generations. He built the layer of the army, the sergeants, that still does the unglamorous work of holding everything together. He lied to get the chance, and once he had it, he proved the lie should have been the truth all along. That tension between the fraud and the genius never fully resolves, and maybe it isn't supposed to. Maybe the uncomfortable lesson buried in the snow at Valley Forge is that the gatekeepers don't always recognize what they need until somebody slips past them. Franklin understood that. He bent the truth on purpose. Gambling that the man was better than his paperwork, he was right. If this one made you think, subscribe and tell me in the comments, where's the line between a lie that betrays people and a lie that saves them? I've got my own answer, and I doubt everyone will share it. I'll see you in the next one.